for you.
Councillor Cornelius, do you believe that elected officials need to take responsibility for these failures?
Yeah.
If it's their fault, yes. Sounds better.
Question 12. Do you really think that the principle of transparency is best served by sneaking this report into this meeting and not making any sort of public statement beforehand to the residents and taxpayers of this borough? It seems to me that that is not what transparency is meant to be. I don't see how any of the known principles have been observed in the way in which you conducted yourselves over the last two administrations now. But this seems incredible to me that you can actually regard such a serious report to be of so little relevance that it doesn't deserve a formal statement to the press.
It should be presented to councillors first, the report, and it's being presented, and there will be an opportunity for councillors to ask Mr. Jones about the report.
Well, I think residents can decide whether or not they think you're being honest and open.
Sorry, Mr. Jacobson again.
No, I'll pass on that.
Okay, Mr. Fletcher. Will you answer?
During the September 20th Council meeting, a dispensation was granted regarding landlords. The report granted was written by Mary and Social on the 2nd of September. Can you confirm whether she was still acting in the capacity of MO?
Aaron Soft was monitoring officer through to the 9th of October.
Mr. Jacobson, about forecasting, number 17.
I hate to interrupt the flow of this other more important question.
Okay. 18, Ms. Slater. You need to ask a supplementary on that one. Sorry, just to help you, you're here as a member of the public rather than as a reporter tonight,
Probably the reporter.
so why didn't you ask for an interview then?
This was answered, would you?
Because I thought this was a bit more democratic.
Okay. It's always nice to know the press are involved in the democratic process.
I'm biased. It's nice to know that as well.
Why was the position of MO advertised and posted internally as opposed to externally?
Well, the approach to recruit to the new senior structure, which was agreed by General Functions Committee back in April 2012, provided for a process whereby there was first an opportunity for internal candidates to be considered for all roles. Where those roles were not filled, those posts were subsequently advertised externally. And that process is the one that covered the recruitment and monitoring officer role at that time.
So, Mr. Jacobson, is there a supplementary for 20 or straight on with the sled?
Let Ms. Slater.
No, I'm good, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Mr. Jacobson? No. 23.
Well, I just really need to know.
In English, practical terms, what does it mean? What is the higher level of support? What does it mean? What is the level now? What is the higher level?
A higher level of support, so some candidates for jobs are very well equipped with doing that job out of. Other people need more help with, can go to quite detailed ones that need cognitive behaviour therapy. There's a whole range from somebody who might have a learning disability and some adjustment that might need to be made So a high level of support is just more support for that person to get a job.
Thank you.
So the next one is number 24. So do you have a supplementary? Will you let the answer this one?
No, I think I'll ask it, thanks.
Thank you.
In the absence of Marion Salter, who was the nominated deputy?
She's absent.
Which is absent, okay.
Well, through periods of absence, Miriam Salter nominated Jessica Farmer from HB Public Law as her deputy.
Number 26. Status, sorry, we're going
Okay. Is Marion Salter allowed to talk about her experience with Barnet, or is that a confidentiality
Could you say it again so I can back up?
Sorry, is Marion Salter allowed to talk about her experience with Barnet, or is there a confidentiality clause associated with that?
Well, the agreement provides for an agreed statement to be utilised by both parties and to make no comment beyond that agreed statement.
And 28. And then 30. 30? No.
Will the services of Westminster Council ask for directly as a result of this report?
We haven't got the services of Westminster Council.
This is a large issue from Westminster Council. Was that the direct response to the report? Was that due to another matter?
Mr. Large was asked to come here initially to give support to the government service and to advise the government service. That was the initial purpose.
Was that as a result of the report, or was that due to another matter?
It was felt that it would be sensible to have someone very experienced who could hold the time.
But would that be to operators?
Yes.
Because of the report and what led up to the initiation. There's another one, 34, sorry. No. Then we're on to 36. No. 38. No. 38 is the answer already. 40, you have the answer. Do you have some supplementaries on this? 38, 40,
No.
41,
No.
42, 43, and 24. No? Fine. Thank you very much. That concludes the question time. Thank you very much for that. There are no members' items that I've been advised of, so item 7, the end of council assembly investigation. If I could ask Mr. Lloyd-Jones to please introduce her report. And thank you very much for coming here tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I've got quite a cold, so my voice is somewhat distorted. So if you can't understand, please ask me to repeat what I'm saying. Thank you very much for inviting me to introduce the reports that I've written. I would first of all like to say a little bit about my background and I think why I was chosen to do the investigations. I am a lawyer, and in fact I do sit as a part-time judge in the social security jurisdiction. I have been a monitoring officer in two different authorities. The first was at Brighton and Hove City Council, and the second was at the London Borough of Hackney. And I was also president of the Association of Monitoring Officers for a period of time. Subsequently, when I became a consultant,
I was elected as the independent chair of the Greater London Authority Standards Committee, so I did do that work at City Hall for a while. And it's interesting perhaps to note that as part of that, monitoring officers, the last 2 monitoring officers at City Hall were not legally qualified. So I have worked as a monitoring officer, but I have also worked with non-legally qualified monitoring officers, and I hope you can see from that that I am very open-minded about these things. I now do work as a consultant, and I do a lot of investigations. I've done investigations into members' behaviour and whether or not there are breaches of code of conduct, but I also do investigations into things that have frankly gone wrong when councils actually want to understand what's going on. Previous one in Barnet, and did an investigation in Southwark that people may be aware of into the refurbishment of the town block that went disastrously wrong. I do have some qualifications on housing because my last full-time job was as chief executive of the Tenant Service Authority, which is a social housing regulator. So that gives you some introduction to my background. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. In terms of the 2 reports that I've written, they're set out as appendices to the Chief Executive's report number 7. Just to remind councillors about what I was actually asked to do. So the requirements of the independent investigation. First of all, I was asked to find out what had happened to cause the events at the council meeting on June the 2nd. And that's in my first report, which appears as Appendix 1. And then secondly, to consider the options to change governance arrangements in order to avoid any possibility of repetition in the future. And that's the second report, which was published slightly later. So how did I go about doing this? In a sense, I was holding a mirror up to the council because I interviewed key players for both those reports, and I also scrutinised a very large number of relevant background documents. And as a result of that, I established some facts. There were certain occasions where accounts seemed to be going in different directions, and I had to therefore rely on my own knowledge and experience to reach conclusions. But I am satisfied that the facts as I found them were what happened at the time. And I hope they serve to explain to you all actually what did happen on June 2nd, because I'm aware that there was a great deal of confusion as to how these reports had come about. In so doing, I think it's important to look at the risks which were inherent in the system at the time. And if you look at the executive summary, which is on page 15, I think, of the published agenda, I set out at 1.4 a number of statements about the risks at present, many of which I think have appeared slightly out of context in terms of press coverage. But I would also like to draw your attention to comments that I made about risk in paragraph 4.1 and 4.2 in terms of the background and context to these events, which points out the massive change that Barnet had been going through with its adoption of the commission model, first authority to do that. And I think the last sentence in 4.1 is worth dwelling on. Despite the revolution undergone by the council, Barnet has been subject to little successful challenge. This fact arguably shows that the risks have been well managed. I think it's very important when you point out the risks to also point out how the management of those risks take place. 4.2 goes on to say, the risks inherent in any change process present in Barnet and include the loss of corporate memory through changing relevant staff, putting Barnet in a position where it doesn't know what it doesn't know. And I think that's very important to remember. My findings, I think, are best summarised in 1.7, which is at the bottom of page 15 again, where I find that there was a joint but not necessarily equal responsibility on Barnet's governance team, as well as the council shared legal service with Harrow, HBPL, for allowing reports containing incorrect advice to be presented to councillors as though they were correct. And those were the findings that I made. But the rest of the report goes on to examine things in more detail, and on pages 12 and 14, the full findings brought out. I thought it would be helpful just to reach that summary. So just very briefly on page 14, I think it's worth bearing in mind that, sorry, it's not page 14, it's page 14 of my report, actually page 26 on the average agenda. I made some recommendations, which I think are very much bells and braces recommendations about how there can be a better and clearer relationship between the governance team in Barnet and HBPL to ensure that there is no such repetition in terms of legal advice being given to full council reports, in the same way that there's a very comprehensive system as to how legal advice is given for committee reports. So, Chair, that's a summary of the first report. Shall I go on to talk about the second report? The second report, which starts on page 31 of the published agenda, was done in a similar way, in that I interviewed a number of people and read a number of documents. And there was a curious agreement, really, between all the people I spoke to about what changes would be the possible options that the council should look at. And they're set out on page 31. And there are those 4 bullet points on under paragraph 1.3. So the first point is to consider whether or not there should be a legally qualified monitoring officer, and to ensure that the monitoring officer has quick and comprehensive access to strategic and confidential legal advice on behalf of the council. The second point is that corporate legal advice can be procured by Barnet and delivered either by a small in-house team of qualified lawyers or by a small number of external legal providers through a panel run by the monitoring officer. And then thirdly, the function of governance support needs greater management input in order to properly focus on Barnet's strategic priorities as expressed through its newly enlarged committee structure and its full council. And then the final point, the clienting of the shared legal services contract should include some element of professional legal assessment. Is the advice that's being given actually a correct summary of the law involved? And I'm afraid you do need a lawyer to give you some advice as to whether or not that question is answered. So the rest of the report goes on to consider the options under the headings of the role of the monitoring officer, governance support, and then in some length I look at the shared legal service, HBPL, and the options actually are very comprehensive in terms of ranging from do nothing to do quite a lot, with various options in between. And I know that the Chief Executive is giving you some recommendations about which of those options would be best in the circumstances. So I think, Chair, I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you very much for that. Would you mind staying on, perhaps answering some questions suggested, but
Yes.
perhaps could then introduce his recommendations and then go into questions.
Thank you, Leader. Firstly, in respect of Mr. Lloyd-Jones' first report, I accept the conclusions of that report and the explanation for the shortcomings in decision making at the annual council meeting. I repeat my previous apology to all members in respect of those shortcomings. Ms Lloyd-Jones sets out some recommendations in section 6 of her report, and I in turn recommend those recommendations to this committee to implement. In respect of Ms Lloyd-Jones' second report, there are three areas of comment. Firstly, around the role of the monitoring officer. Secondly, in respect of governance support. And thirdly, in respect of the shared legal service. Firstly, with regard to the monitoring officer and the qualifications of the monitoring officer, when I drafted this report, there was no vacancy. But now, sitting here today, there is a vacancy for the assurance director role, which is the monitoring officer in the council's structure. And therefore, irrespective of the discussion about the qualifications for that post, there's an opportunity for a remuneration committee, which is responsible for making that appointment, to consider the role profile prior to that role being advertised. And no doubt that committee will have regard to your discussions in that matter tonight. In respect of the potential for sharing the monitoring officer, which is one of the options that Ms Lloyd-Jones members will have their own view. I mean, my view, my advice would be that this would go to another level in respect to the council's current approach to shared services, and my recommendation would be that it would not be an appropriate way forward for the council at this time. My recommendation would be that in the circumstances the council should retain its own monitoring officer for the time being, and should take the recruitment for the assurance director forward on that basis. In respect of the other monitoring officer options, and particularly in respect of the directly controlled legal capacity that Mr. Lloyd-Jones talks about, I think the points that she makes around potential for improvement are well made. And I do think the council's arrangements would be strengthened by having that directly controlled scope around a high-level corporate legal support to be directly controlled by the council, whether that's through directly employed legal officers or through a panel of external suppliers, or a combination of the two. Essentially, in my opinion, that is a sensible way forward for the council in the circumstances, and is recommended for approval tonight. Now that would need to be negotiated with Barnet Council because it would imply some change to the current arrangement. So that's, if you do agree that recommendation tonight, we'll need to take that away and discuss the changes to the inter-authority agreement with Barnet and bring that back to you for further consideration. In respect of governance support, the report raises the question about the Council's approach to assurance more generally, and is set up for the moment the assurance function, which encompasses the monitoring officer role, plays an important and wider role in respect of the way that the Council operates and the architecture of the Commissioning Council. The idea is that it should ensure robust and comprehensive governance across the full range of legal and other assurance processes. It seems to me that has worked well as a function for the Council since it was introduced in 2013. My recommendation to members would be that it would be sensible to retain that approach. In other words, an overall assurance function with an assurance director role encompassing the monitoring officer role. That seems to me to be a sensible way of working. That has worked well. And as I say, I would recommend that assurance function is retained. In respect of the shared legal service, the monitoring arrangements for the shared service are set out in the agreement, and they involve the two chief executives of the organisations and other officers meeting regularly, and of course from a contractual point of view, the service is subject to our normal performance management regime, which culminates in reports to contract and performance management. committee. Certainly, those platforms have shown a good level of performance by HB Law, a high quality of services by and large being provided to both organisations. In respect of Ms Lloyd-Jones's comments on this, it seems to me to be the case that the designation of the monitoring officer as the client for the shared legal service is a helpful clarification of what is in the Insurance Authority agreement. And recommend that so we proceed down that route. I've already said that the recommendation in respect of having some directly controlled legal capacity is one that I would recommend to you. That, of course, would also provide the direct legal expertise to manage the arrangement with Harrow. So therefore, would also meet that requirement. So in summary, the recommendations for immediate change in respect of report 1 are recommended for your approval. We recommend that the council retain its own monitoring officer and that the integrated assurance functions retained. We also recommend that the council does remove limited scope of high-level legal support from the arrangements with Harrow Council and provides that directly in-house or separately or by a combination of the two. And finally, that if you do agree that recommendation tonight, that we seek to negotiate those changes with Harrow Council and bring those proposals back to you for your approval in due course. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive explanation. Members, might I suggest that we ask Ms Lloyd-Jones questions now and then move on to asking questions of officers and then to political discussion between ourselves afterwards. Questions from Ms Lloyd-Jones? Yes, or more?
Thank you. One of the issues for debate this evening is the legal qualification or not of the monitoring officer. It's not a legal obligation to have a legally qualified monitoring officer, but I wondered, you have a lot of experience of a range of organisations. How common is it to have a monitoring officer who is not legally qualified? Do we have a sense of how many authorities and sorts of authorities for whom that is the case?
I'm afraid I don't know what the absolute numbers are, and I've looked at confirmation with beating it, but my acknowledgement of the experience of the monitoring officer market in England certainly is that the vast majority of monitoring officer posts are held by lawyers. Although there are many circumstances, and I explained the circumstances of the Barnet Council Authority, where there are very satisfactory arrangements where the monitoring officer post is held by a non-lawyer. It's the arrangements around that are significant, I think.
And a further question, and this is obviously a matter of judgment, but you comment in your report that Barnet's structure is novel, that in a sense the commissioning council puts us out of the ordinary in terms of councils. And I have a view about this, but I wonder if you have got a view, having taken the report, that the value of having a legally qualified monitoring officer as part of that process, and whether you feel that over and above any obligations around standard within councils, you think there's an additional, perhaps, need in the council in such going through such changes.
I can understand where you're coming from on this, and I think the report reflects some of that. Indeed, in our conversation, I think you were the person who came up with the phrase about corporate memory being lost. And there was a set of circumstances where a number of people were newly appointed at the time when the previous monitoring officer who was legally qualified had left. However novel Barnet's arrangements are, one of the other points I've made is that there has been one error, but the risks inherent in that have not led to a series of errors, as far as I'm aware from all the interviews I've conducted.
it was the events of June 2nd which were the problem that we're looking at. I have put a legally qualified monitoring officer as an option because that is what most local authorities do. But it really isn't up to me to make a decision about it. And I think it would be unfortunate if I was drawn into giving my own opinion on that. Thank you.
Okay, no, it's just, I remember this authority at one time used to have its chief executive or town clerk. It always used to be a barrister or a solicitor. Since then, things have changed. We've had surveyors, I think, we've had economists. What do you use, Mr. Travis? What's your conclusion? And whatever it is, things have changed. The criteria for me, for anybody, any sort of important post like this, is not whether they're a solicitor with, say, conveyancing experience or matrimonial experience, because that doesn't mean it's not really relevant to what's going on there. It's really relevant to somebody with a clear head. Now, whether that clear head is somebody who's an accountant, whether that's somebody who can read, is a corporate financier, or somebody who has gone into any sort of field which needs perspectives and needs to be clearly looked at, that is the criteria, not necessarily a legally qualified person. Would you agree with that sort of analysis?
I think those are all matters that a good agreement panel would want to bear in mind, because with any job description, the level of qualification is only one element. You're quite right as to what a total job would look like. And certainly senior management experience, the ability to make quick decisions, the ability to involve and consult and work with stakeholders are all very important qualities for very senior people in a local authority to have. So yes, I would completely agree with you.
Do you have any evidence that Marion would have that?
Well, I have to say, Councillor Flynn, if I go into the hospital to get my tonsils out, I'd like the person with a clear head, but I'm not a qualified doctor. I do have a question in relation to page 32 of our papers, on the role of the monitoring officer, paragraph 2.4. You state that, as I have to say, it's a very clearly written report to read. It was a very open, clear English. You say that the task of, and this question relates to the fact that we're talking about the role of the monitoring officer, but we're also talking about the role of being client to an outsourced legal service. And you make the comment that the task of interpreting externally procured legal advice is best done by another qualified lawyer, and the task of working out how to ask the right questions. And so the question is that actually, when you completely outsource something, how do you know that you're getting the right service? And surely the conclusion I've drawn from this report is you need to have an in-house client that is a lawyer, a legally qualified in-house client that can do that and take ownership. Because I, as a councillor, and non-legally qualified officers aren't going to know necessarily what the legal traps are, unless, and I think it's having, if you are instructing someone externally, you need to know that A, the advice you're getting is correct, and B, the questions to ask, and I think you very clearly put that in that paragraph. And I would be interested in your comments on that type of the relationship.
Yes, I think the clear intention when the shared legal services inter-authority agreement was put together was that the legally qualified monitoring officer at Barnet at the time would take a substantial role in clienting the agreement. And therefore it wasn't expressed in any fuller way in the IAA because that was the assumption. And I think the Chief Executives picked that up, that it's something that actually Barnet now needs to re-examine. Because although nobody has said that HBPL aren't performing well, and they perform very well on all the figures that we've got, on what you may call the transactional work, if you don't have somebody to actually look at the legal advice that's received back at a very senior and strategic level, you are missing a trick. and I think that's the point that you're making. In terms of this story, I think there is a part of it that also illustrates the earlier point that you made. If you recall, James Gowdy QC was instructed to look at the situation, and once his advice was forthcoming, Andrew Travers wrote to everybody to explain what that was. When you brief council, you actually have to write a brief, and that brief contains the questions to ask. And that brief actually wasn't written by Barnet, it was written by Harrow. And therefore, in those circumstances, if there had been a legally qualified monitoring officer in Barnet, you would have had more control over what the questions were being asked to leading council at that point. So that's simply an example that was within my knowledge. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
So in terms of your point there on control, for me, the recommendations on page 31 of the, looking at how you can deliver quick and comprehensive access to strategic and confidential legal advice. If that's done by an outsourced provider, no matter how it is, how do you believe it can be done in a quick way with control if it's by an agreement that has these delays built in?
I think it's perfectly possible to build an extra layer, if you like, by having an outsourced source of confidential legal advice. But it is an extra layer, and I think you've got to bear that in mind if that's a decision that's subsequently taken. I think the issue for Barnet, though, and I'm very glad the Chief Executive is supporting this, is that there will be times, possibly, when actually you don't agree with Harrow about something, and that therefore puts HBPL in a very difficult position of a potential conflict of interest in terms of whatever it is that Barnet's seeking advice about. So if you do choose tonight to be able to have control over how you seek very senior strategic and corporate advice, you completely avoid that possibility of happening.
I'm not quite sure how to put this into a question, if I may, at this point. Only whether the Barnet has taken external legal advice rather than relying on Harrow for sound.
Yes, I am. And the I, sorry.
Sorry.
Yes, I am. And the IAA doesn't actually contemplate that happening. So the fact that you've done it is important for you to have done it, but what we're recommending is that there's a complete clarity inside agreement to the IAA, which there would never be any possibility of saying that you didn't have the authority to do that in the future.
Good evening. I'd like to thank you for your report. It's a very, in one sense, condemning report of what's been happening in Barnet in relation to the legal service. But I have a couple of questions I want to ask you. The first question is, you talk in paragraph 3.4 on page 17 of the Bugle document, rather than page 5 of the report, that you had access to a large number of documents to read. I'm just wondering whether officers gave you the documents that have been submitted to the audit committee of the council, or specifically the end of project report that set up the shared service. The audit committee report dated the 8th of April 2013 and then 22nd of April 2014. And none of the officers gave you access to these?
No, I haven't seen this.
Which is a real shame, because what these documents consistently talk about is the need to actually have contract monitoring in place, and it doesn't seem to be any evidence whatsoever that the council has actually been able to have proper controls over the contract with Harold Legal Services, and the fact that you haven't seen these means you weren't able to comment, and that's a real shame.
Well, I spoke to the head of the commercial team who does the contract monitoring, and that's why in the options report I draw the distinction between contract monitoring and clienting. And I think possibly what you're saying there would underline that contract monitoring can be done in a very formulaic way, which is, what are the performance indicators under this contract, what does the score look like, whereas clienting is actually about quality and the overview generally of the services being delivered.
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't raise that because it raises the political points about maybe we wouldn't be sitting here if we had a proper contract arrangements in place to look at this particular report. I'd also like to go to page 22, just a question I have in relation to the chronology. We talk about from the 27th of May, from Barnet Group, and then the 22nd of June, to take the reports to council, and these reports were actually legally cleared. But what's not clear to me is how, if Barnet's governance service actually chased these up to try and get a response from Harold before the documents went to councillors to make decisions.
No, I do mention that somewhere, that there was no escalation, as I called it, because I think what you'd expect is for an officer, a more junior officer, to contact a more senior officer, and that doesn't seem to, well, it didn't happen in this case.
Oh, yeah. At the top of page 20, you make comments about the monitoring of SRO not being part of the corporate management of the council. Would you think that that would be in Barnet Council's interest to have a monitoring as part of the corporate management team?
Again, it's one of those features which is different with every local authority, partly because every local authority is organised slightly differently, and partly because in some authorities, increasingly few, I think, the monitoring officer is on the top table. When Mr. Lustig was here, for example, he was called, I think, the Director of Corporate Governance, and that post sat on the top table before the restructuring took place. In many authorities, for example, the one I worked with before in Southwark, the monitoring officer post is held by the Director of Legal Services, and she's actually a second-tier officer. She reports to the Director of Corporate Services. So there are many options as to where the monitoring officer should sit. The important thing is that the authority respects the statutory role that the monitoring officer has to carry out, and make sure that the lines of communication are very short, so that the monitoring officer doesn't have to find things out by accident, but actually has a proper way of understanding what's contemplated, what's in the future, how the monitoring officer can best procure legal advice to ensure that councillors will be safe in their decision making on whatever it is that they're deciding.
Just have one final question, which actually has two parts to it, really. Given the necessity to call you in to do your investigation and your findings about failing really on legal services, whether it's provided by Harold or not, I need to have a question on page 19 in paragraph 4.8, because it seems to me that, from my point of view, all the decision that may have been made under the advice that may have been given by the then monitoring officer may well be legally open to some kind of challenge. And so that's the first question. The second part of my question is that the Barnet Council has in place a very bizarre and strange group called the Leaders Panel, which deals with, as you say, member behaviour. And it's my understanding that the advice given from the monitoring officer to that panel is that members who are under investigation do not have the right to any representation at the interview or the hearing. It seems to me to fly in the face of any concept of natural justice that I'm used to, where people who are accused of some misconduct would have a right to have some kind of friend or legal representative. I don't know what your view is of that.
I haven't actually looked at either of those issues because neither of those issues fell within the brief that I was given. But on the first point, I think Barnet has exhibited considerable bravery in getting an independent investigator and publishing the report in full. And actually there was a public question which I didn't get a chance to answer because the person asking it wasn't here at the time, which seemed to imply that there may have been several drafts which were adopted or whatever. That is absolutely untrue. This is my work. I asked for factual corrections and I made those factual corrections. But apart from that, I do think Barnet has exhibited a degree of transparency and actually wanting to do the right thing in terms of making decisions to prevent what were terrible events, let's face it. No local authority would want to be in the position that Barnet was in on the 2nd of June. And therefore to do it in public and to make recommendations about it is exactly the right thing to do.
Could I just press you then on my first point I made with my last question, which was potentially all of the decisions, the legal advice, is potentially open to legal challenge?
Well, we do know that the monitoring officer here obtained legal advice from the shared legal services arrangements. As I say, I wasn't asked to look at the way that legal advice had been given over the intervening period. I was simply asked to look at what happened there. But I think if you've got any particular concerns, the best way of dealing with it now, and particularly a question like the leaders panel, for example, would be to have a conversation with Mr. Large at some point, and I'm sure as interim legally qualified monitoring officer, he'd be able to give you some advice about that.
Just drawing back to the report while we have an opportunity to question you, you've mentioned the issue around the seeking of legal advice from James Dowdy, that was effectively commissioned by Harrow Barnet Public Law. And you made reference to the fact that we might have more control were doing that via a legally qualified monitoring officer. And I have been going through, and you made several references to it in your report, the inter-authority agreement and the tacit presumption within it that the monitoring officer will be legal. Within that, there is a mechanism around the strategic monitoring board, and on that, the Director of Corporate Governance of Barnet, until the assurance director of Barnet is appointed, would represent Barnet on the strategic monitoring board. The Director of Law and Governance in Harrow is on that, as are the two chief executives. And then practice director in Harrow and the contract manager in Barnet. And you discussed earlier the issue about the contract manager being very much around the practical nitty-gritty around the contract monitoring. Do you think that Barnet is at a disadvantage in that strategic monitoring board not having that independent legal support within the Barnet purview, and that the legal person within that strategic monitoring board is actually a member of Harrow Barnet Public Law rather than a member having particular and specific interests for Barnet?
Hugh Peart, who's the Harrow Monitoring Officer, is quite rightly, as you say, the Director of, I think it's Legal and Governance, I think that's his full title. He's not actually in HBPL, it's Jessica Farmer who's the head of practice. So actually Harrow had the advantage of having advice about the shared services arrangement through Hugh, who can assess whether or not HBPL do whatever it is that Harrow wants them to do. There is a second way of looking at it in the Harrow arrangement. If Barnet takes external legal advice to do the same thing, I think, which is the Chief Executive's recommendation, then Barnet will take control over those issues and won't be at a disadvantage.
Thank you. I do have some concerns in that area because of that inequality within the relationship, potentially.
Two issues I wanted to help you with. One is, obviously you look at the inter-authority agreement and you've got the side or second agreement.
Yeah.
And in that way, you're ahead of us as elected members. But you do mention, and it's on, well, page 18, that original agreement actually said that the Barnet monitoring officer was also to be legally qualified professional client. So it does seem that at that time, with the original negotiations with Harrow, it was considered an important post. You then later got the side agreement, the one that says remains unsigned, so in a way it isn't published. Was there an obvious rationale for moving from the original agreement that talks about a legally qualified client? I mean, within the report, I suppose there might still be confidential, but I just wonder, have you a sense of what the rationale was to be moving from the first agreement to the side agreement that seemed to move from you need a professional legal client to almost a non-client relationship, a different sort of relationship?
I think because events moved on, in hindsight is a wonderful thing, it's slightly difficult to be completely accurate about this. But the way I understood it, particularly talking it through with the Harrow staff who were involved in negotiating it, for example, is that the IAA effectively carves out what the monitoring officer does, because at the time Barnet had a fully functioning monitoring officer, and in fact he stayed, I think, for a period of 9 months or so after the IAA was first came into effect, and the lawyers transferred over from Barnet to Harrow. The side agreement was to cover the situation where there wasn't a legally qualified monitoring officer, and to cover advice that might have been given directly to Barnet by a legally qualified monitoring officer, but now actually where the non-legally qualified monitoring officer needed to procure that level of advice that otherwise wouldn't have needed to be procured.
I think so. In a way, so it's not like an appendix to the first report, but a supplementary report because of the change of circumstances.
To reflect the circumstances that pertained at the time, yes.
And the only other point is part of clarity. Now, awful confession to make, even though I've been against for a long time, I've not read every section of every Local Government Act. Shame that. But this section 101 of the Local Government Act 1972, you seem to have some relevance. Because it seems that rather than a contract where you make a joint agreement, is it that by using that section, you're not just delegating roles, you're also delegating, sorry, it's on page 18, you just mentioned that using section 101, which you suggest should not be used, with recommendations, means that whilst this decision is involved, only Harrow will be able to make decisions about Barnet's legal function. In other words, by using that section of the Act, has Barnet given up some of its responsibility about its own legal function? In other words, as well as deciding how things should be run on an operational level, what is the weakness of using that section? It would help.
It's actually quite unusual to use that section, which doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't be using it. If I can actually refer to paragraph 4.10 of the second report, which is on page 36 of the Barnet documents. I had a subsequent conversation with Harrow's monitoring officer, and he was very clearly of the view that because the inter-authority agreement carves out the monitoring officer work, that Barnet hasn't delegated its powers under that part of that function to Harrow. And it's very unclear from the two committee reports. There was a parallel committee report in Harrow on the same evening as there was a committee report here, and it does need clarifying. But I think given that you're going to take the opportunity of resetting those relationships and redrafting and reviewing the side agreement, I think you will actually take the opportunity of making sure that Section 101 doesn't by accident apply to things that actually you want to do yourself.
Thanks for that.
Just
recognise your remit has been focused on this agreement, but in terms of the IAA itself, do you think, as it was put together, that sufficient understanding of all the risks involved of the arrangements was done as part of the IAA?
The IAA certainly does contemplate risks, but as a contract, it's a 5-year contract and it's 2 years into that. It can benefit from a review, as all documents can, because the situation has moved on. And I'm absolutely confident that that will happen as part of looking at the side agreement. It has to. So I think that's contemplated in the Chief Executive's recommendations as well.
In regards to the general risks with change processes we're undergoing, and your reference to not knowing what we don't know, do you think that there's benefits to having someone we have access to at a ready pace locally, that given the amount of risks we still have, whilst you say that Barnet has been subject to little successful challenge thus far, we're still very early days in our commissioning model, and I would say that there's a lot of risks similar to this in a lot of other contracts we've put out. Inherently there's risks in outsourced arrangements. The risk doesn't disappear, so do you not think that there's benefit to having that legal experience more readily available, given the amount of risks we've undertaken?
Making decisions at local government level is a risky business, and part of risk management is identifying risks and then managing them and mitigating them in some way. Some risks are going to be more troublesome than others in terms of how you mitigate them. But I think the Chief Executive's recommendations is doing precisely that, in recognition of some of the risks that are in the system. He's recommending the various steps to reduce the risk of any further interference with the government's arrangements in future.
Councillor Houston, and then we might need to...
Two sort of questions. One is in relation to, again, the report says that it talks about the monitoring officer and the fact that most local authorities do have a lawyer doing that job. And it says the reasons for doing so is that it's thought that the statutory requirement for duties to be performed personally is best satisfied by a senior and experienced lawyer. As we said before, there's also the requirement to client, from the monitoring officer role, but also the client, the contract. And there's a requirement a monitoring officer appoints a deputy. Now, I suppose my question is, given we are a commissioning council, it seems to me crazy not to have an in-house resource that's a legal expert in contracts, as well as an in-house resource that's an expert on governance issues. And it seems to me that it is a risk not to have a deputy that's also legal, but I know it's not a requirement, but given the model we have, it seems to me that would be, and the question is, with all your comments on that, whether it could be beneficial potentially to have at least a head of legal or a deputy head of legal, who are, or whatever you want to call them, legally qualified.
There was a decision made by one of Barnet's committees at the beginning of 2013, which addressed the issue of the appointment of the Deputy Monitoring Officer. And it was agreed in that report that it would be either Jessica Farmer or somebody else from HBPL. So in a sense, you've already got a precedent that the Deputy Monitoring Officer would be legally qualified from that particular role.
I suppose it's in relation to the clienting role as well, because we do have a lot of very complicated contracts. We have a lot of, and it is about asking, as you say very clearly, if you don't know the questions to ask, and a lawyer will know the questions to ask, how do you, and it seems to me that trying out on this is the lead, seeing beyond this, because the same principles apply, someone who knows a bit about contract law, because we've become a very contractual council in terms of our relationships.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think if you have a panel of external lawyers, you could ask one of them to perform that role if you don't choose to have the legally qualified person actually working in-house. There are options available for that.
I have a slightly other thing, very quickly. Your comment on the role of Harrow's changing its structure for legal services and bringing in the sort of business structure. Is it? And I understand the reason for that is to end up buying or extending services to other local authorities potentially. Do you see any issues that we should be wary of in terms of that? Because that's imminent, I understand, in the subject.
Yes, HPPL were granted a licence last month by the Solicitors Regulation Authority to come into effect from the 1st of December of this year to run an alternative business structure. I'm afraid I don't know how they contemplate doing it, and I think that would have to be part of negotiations which would happen between the two authorities. But clearly I think Barnet needs to decide what it wants to get out of the ABS and advocate that.
Thank you.
That's the last question.
Absolutely, it's just referring back to the issue around Section 101 and the issue around side agreement. Obviously we haven't, because sometimes we haven't seen the side agreement hasn't been published. So as Councillor already said, you have the advantage over us. But I'm just trying to tease out my own head. Clearly, Section 101 and its use around the original IAA, you were carving out a set of work, and therefore it was presumably seen as so unusual, not problematic. Do you think the side agreement cuts across that and gives problems with regards to Section 101 regulations that we're having to go to Harrow for things that would normally reside within the parent council?
I think you now have an opportunity, and I have to say the discussions I've had with Harrow as part of this report, they're very open to an opportunity to clarify all of these issues that's arisen. I can't give you any categorical answers about that, but I think you can negotiate whatever deal feels best for Barnet and have an honest and open conversation with Harrow about that.
Thank you very much for answering all those questions. Mr. Travers has been thanks again for that. Just wanted to say something about the IA.
Well, just to clarify that point about the sequence of the agreement. So the original IAA did carve out the monitoring officer role and reserved that for Barnet. That was when Jeff Lustig was fulfilling that role. In the period of the transition from Mr. Lustig, who was planning to leave the council, to Mary Ellen Salter as the assurance director and monitoring officer, then that was reconsidered. It was reconsidered by the Remuneration Committee on the 29th of January 2013, when the deputising arrangements for all chief officers were agreed. And at that point, in contemplation of the change, it was decided that whereas previously Jeff Lustig was the monitoring officer with Mary Ellen Salter as the deputy, from Jeff's departure, when Mary Ellen Salter assumed the monitoring officer role, the deputy monitoring officer role would be provided by HB law. Hence the draft side agreement inserting that role, that enhanced role, into the original agreement. So that was the sequence and the logic of why that happened.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Thank you very much for coming here tonight. Thank you. So, members, comments, and the political forward in this report. Councillor Edwards.
Yeah, I've got some questions I'd like to ask the Chief Executive, if I may. You'll note that one of my first questions to Mr. Lloyd-Jones was about documentation, and I would like to know from the Chief Executive why he didn't share with the documents that I referred to, particularly the learning lesson documents and the two audit meeting documents, which were quite critical of the shared legal arrangements we have with Harrow Legal Services, and made some recommendations about contract control, employing a contracting officer, that there were serious risks in the 2013 audit report. There were serious risks in relation to the high level of advice on strategic and governance matters, both to members and to senior officers. seems to be really pertinent reports, particularly in terms of them making judgments about the state of affairs that led to the shambles that she refers to in her report. So I'd like to know why the documents weren't actually shared with the investigating officer.
Well, what I can say is that in my discussions with Ms. Lloyd-Jones, I tried to make sure that every possible relevant document was available to her, and that at that time, to the best of my knowledge, we did make documents available to her, and of course, if she asked for any other documents, they were provided. So there was no intent at any time to suppress or hide any of those documents which were indeed in the public domain. So whilst they may primarily concerned with the contract management aspects of the arrangement rather than the clienting aspects, so may not be seen to be so directly relevant. There was certainly no intent to conceal those documents, which, as I say, were in the public domain.
I didn't actually suggest that you were concealing them. What I asked is why you didn't share them with the investigating officer. They made pertinent comments about the state of our arrangements with our legal services, and as far as I can see, and the one thing that I mentioned was this 2013 report made a specific point about the risks of this contract in terms of the governance arrangements and in terms of the support to senior officers and executive members. And in her report, you hear very clearly that the 2nd of June council meeting, we were given reports and documents that had not been cleared legally, and the internal audit reports of our council showed back in 2013 that this was a risk and a disaster waiting to happen. And it seems incredulous to me that these documents weren't shared with the investigating officer. I'm not suggesting you deliberately hid them, but I just don't understand why they weren't shared, because it seems to me to be a major failing in our support, our documentation that we've given to an investigating officer.
I think that's a statement rather than a question, the latter clause.
Well, my question has been answered.
I suspect it's a question that can't be answered, but clearly by what happened afterwards, those weaknesses were shown and we all saw them. So, thank you.
Yeah, the point I'm making is that these recommendations were never implemented, and maybe we would, like I said to the investigating officer, perhaps you wouldn't be here having this discussion this evening if the recommendations made in those 3 reports had been implemented, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence that we did.
That may be possible. Thank you. Any other observations or comments? As it is.
Yeah, I want to just raise the issue of, I think this was a very blunt report and a pretty damning report, and on page 15, 7.3, one of the conclusions in the first report was the risk of either of those reports being wrong was therefore high, as a response to the previous finding. Given that Barnet does not employ any lawyers itself, and the relevant governance staff responsible for these reports are relatively inexperienced, and the question is viewed that do you not think that actually this is a consequence of the way in which we've outsourced? The kind of thin client model, the path towards outsourcing, the loss of experienced staff, and the fact that we do not retain adequate in-house servicing. I mean, but I just think this has potential consequences to happen in other areas like procurement, where we've outsourced procurement to a captor, and captor might be bidding for contracts. And there's all those sort of issues where I think we've got this wrong. I don't agree with outsourcing in the first place, but that's happened. I do think this if you do not learn from mistakes, other things are going to come back to bite us. And I do think we need to learn from this. And as I say, our regulation of procurement, that's one area where I can see greater problems ahead. I think there are other areas where we're going to have similar sort of situation.
The remuneration committee looked at that last night with respect to two new posts that have been created with just that in mind, to strengthen the monitoring arrangements and to employ experts in these matters who can follow what is being proposed and what is happening from start to finish. Now clearly, as regards the legal services here, there was a breakdown. There's no disguising that breakdown. The provision was there for advice to be obtained from Barnet Harrow law. The fact that that advice was not received or was not asked for, whatever the conclusion you come from in allocating blame, there was a weakness there, and none of us can disguise that. We had a fully qualified lawyer sitting there in the annual meeting of the council, and the annual meeting of the council was a very poor show, and that was the first inkling we had of something that was wrong. But this wasn't immediately apparent on the night, and that's something that we all need to reflect about. Clearly, no councillor had ever raised a point about proportionality. That was not raised at all.
Can I just respond to that?
Yes.
Because I think the issue is ownership. And that's, you've just summed up why this is a problem. If nobody raised it, councillors aren't experts on the Local Government Act in detail. It's not and actually it's about ownership. And when you have outsourced staff, you have a contractual arrangement with them. And if you don't ask them, if it's not in the contract or in the KPIs or a question you've not asked or something that's all priced up for you to give the answer for, and this is a general comment about outsourcing, you have problems because people, the danger is when you've got lawyers and in-house staff, most private companies do not outsource their strategic functions. For that reason, you have ownership and loyalty, and I think those things you can't, it is very difficult to get in the same way when everything becomes purely transactional.
Most businesses would outsource their legal function.
Large businesses would keep an in-house client.
And that's what we should do.
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Moore.
Much of the discussion tonight has hung really on elements of the inter-authority agreement and civil side agreement. When you and the deputy leader signed off the delegated power that agreed the inter-authority agreement in mid-August 2012, in a way that wasn't subject to call-in, did you envisage at that point having a monitoring officer who was not legally qualified? When you subsequently a non-legally qualified monitoring officer was appointed, were you happy with the side agreement that made the changes to that inter-authority agreement? If I could just add to that so that you have an opportunity to answer in the round. We've had mention tonight of the licence granted to HBPL. And one of the things that we're considering here is the value Barnet gets, or the service Barnet gets out of this. What risk assessment has gone on around the impact to Barnet of that recent licence agreement granted, which is about offering services, effectively trading or going into partnerships with a range of boroughs? And do you think that that side agreement is robust enough to protect Barnet without having a legally qualified monitoring officer? And how are you going to be risk assessing that whole package?
That's a whole series of questions, and if I fail to answer anything, please break me along the way. Thank you. I think it is the side agreement and the way that the legal service is run with Harrow will have to be reviewed, and a comprehensive review will have to take place now. It's very important for us that we do receive good legal advice, and the assumption has always been that we would get that from English Public Law. Indeed, Barnet's lawyers transferred over to that organisation en masse, and I think you were on I don't believe the matter was called in. I'm not sure that it wasn't subject to call in.
I was referring specifically to the inter-authority agreement and you signing that obviously delegated powers report, because certainly the published IAA actually has a whole set of things within it that are to be decided or with no information, and one of those was a risk assessment actually.
But that report was not exempt.
It was not exempt. It was an officer report signed off in consultation with you, and you and the deputy leader. It wasn't subject to call in.
It could have been called in. It was not exempted from call.
It was an officer report signed off by the officer in consultation with the deputy leader. And the question is, and in going through it, there are a series of holes. And so I'm concerned about that, but I'm also concerned about whether you envisage at any point there being a non-legally qualified monitoring officer, because clearly the terms of the IAA were not suitable for that to be the case. Hence the side agreement, which is currently unsigned, and about which actually I have quite significant concerns, because in its current format, my understanding, though I haven't read it, is that it hands over a set of support guidance around governance issues, which I would want to see it retained in-house.
It's a long while ago, and I am relying on my memory here, but I don't believe that I contemplated at that stage that we would have a monitoring officer who was not qualified.
And what risk assessment went on? Because obviously you were still a cabinet member at that stage, lead a cabinet member at that stage, to look at what the impact would be on the organisation and what the implications were for governance.
No, I'm just saying, just to clarify that it was subject to call in, it wasn't called in, and therefore all the comments which Councillor Moore is now saying, she's saying with hindsight, she did not foresee the thing which had happened, just as we didn't foresee the thing that happened there. So let's get it straight. What we didn't know, you didn't know, and what you knew, we knew. So therefore, let's not get this to that it wasn't subject to call in, you didn't call it in there, and therefore they are on equal status on that ground. So don't fix that up.
No, hang on. For clarity of fact, I have justified the action taken under delegated powers by officer in consultation with cabinet member in executive function. It was not subject to calling because it was not a member delegated power.
It was then subject after that, you didn't get to any committees, you didn't get to council as a criticism, you accepted it, disagreed, accepted it. So let's be honest about things. We've both made mistakes, we've made mistakes, you've made mistakes, so let's be honest about it. Let's go forward and let's get things sorted out from now onwards. And let's be honest, that's the thing.
The honest answer then is it could not be called in, full stop.
Let's go forward.
So there wasn't opportunity.
And it was done.
You could have brought it to council, you could have brought it to committee, you didn't.
For missing it, have done.
You could have done things, you didn't do it, you didn't foresee it, just as we didn't foresee things. So therefore, let's go forward, let's have a discussion.
You can always be your own doctor and your own solicitor. I know a fool when I see one. Plenty around the table.
The point at the heart of this is actually we've gone into an arrangement which has changed significantly, but may or may not be fit for purpose currently, and did go through under those circumstances, and actually had been subject to calling. There were a series of things that would quite rightly have raised concerns, one would quite rightly have raised concerns about.
You didn't.
Because it's an officer delegated power, not subject to calling. I'm sorry, but that's true. And so the crux of this, the issue, the question was, you've answered the first question.
Councillor, please, what is the next question?
The next question, you have said that you didn't envisage it.
Yes.
I asked you about...
At the time.
Yes, and I asked you about the risk assessment that went on in preparation for the side agreement. What risk assessment went on then, and then what risk assessment in terms of the impact of the current licensing in light of the side agreement that you want to go ahead and sign, because that does give me some concerns about the way it enshrines within Harrow Barnet law the inability currently of us to make decisions independently legally.
Yes, just before.
So that's ill put, but you
I
have to see.
I get the sense. We ought to be very certain of what we assign. It's not something that I can sign as leader. No, it is something that we need to look at and make sure that the service as is envisaged is going to be satisfactory for us as we move forward. And as Mr. Bugle said, 2 years in, it is time to look at it very carefully and have a think about that. And I'm sure that's what we can do. And Mr. Travers, you were going to talk about the chronology, or?
Just to clarify on that point, the inter-authority agreement delegated action was in August 2012. And the appointment of Mary and Salt by the Remuneration Committee was in October 2012. But I think the point on the side agreement is simply to say that in the very short term it should be signed because it effectively governs the arrangements that are in place as of today. If you agree the recommendations in this report, recommendation 3, then we will need to go away and come up with a new agreement with Harrow to govern that new settlement issue plan, between what Barnet does and what Harrow does. So the side agreement is only about the very short term.
And there is the vexed question of, given the changes to HBPL and the licence and therefore the intention to extend the services to others. In terms of your confidence that Barnet will get what you envisaged originally as a shared service with Harrow?
Well, if it weren't for the 2 shortcomings that have been so obvious to us all, I would have said that this agreement was working very well. And there have been no complaints about the transactional services that go on, no complaints about that. The advice we've had, I think, has been satisfactory. And we have won cases, we have not lost them. We've been successful. But there have been 2 shortcomings, and we must address that and make sure that that doesn't happen. And you started me now, so I'll carry on a little bit. But I mean, we must keep this in perspective as well. What has happened and the consequences from what has happened. Okay, there's a loss of reputation, we understand that. However, that is something that can be addressed and must be addressed to make sure it can't happen again. But we must keep it in perspective that all that's happened is that there are more Conservatives on the committees. That's the only result of it, actually. But without it, the annual meeting was the first time that any of us saw anything wrong in governance or in services, and it became very apparent at that stage to all of us and very publicly. And shortly thereafter, we had the questioning of the proportionality and the other matter, and which need to be addressed now. One, and then Councillor Longstaff.
If I might just briefly, I think the issue, and we've mentioned the novelty of the service structure, but of course we have moved back to a committee system where actually advice to members and issues around governance are absolutely critical, because we have a whole series of councillors right the way across the council making decisions at committees, and there is a concern, I think, to ensure that that is done in a way that best serves Barnet.
But do you have any specific complaints about the legal advice that's been received at those committee meetings where lawyers have been sitting there?
I certainly think that there would be merit in reviewing all of the decisions taken by the monitoring officer since we had a non-legally qualified. But there have been, as you know well, 1 or 2 glitches where it was quite clear that members of HBPL didn't have a strong grasp of the niceties of Barnet's standing orders on committees, and there are oddities like that certainly have come up and been quite public actually, and could have led to improper decision making, certainly with respect to the planning committee.
Yes, but at that time we had a legally qualified monitoring officer.
The article job.
Councillor.
Thank you, Chairman. I think tonight we've had some fantastic hindsights. Everybody's perfect when it comes to hindsight. But in the lead up to HB public law, I can't recall any motions on the issue. I can't recall any questions to Cabinet on the issue. So this all comes down to Claer Lloyd-Jones' excellent summary, executive summary, where she says she was asked to investigate and establish the facts around the processes leading up to and after the presentation of the reports to the annual meeting. It's nice discussion has gone way beyond that and has been very, very critical of lots of people and indeed of HB law. But this week, I don't know how many people know, but the Law Society gave HB Public Law high commendation in their annual awards, and that the judges were impressed by the innovative way in which HB Public Law merged their legal services, achieved financial savings, improved systems, and worked hard to create a positive working culture within the legal services department. And I think that's a very important thing to remember, that staff do work hard, and we need to get back to what this was about, which was the problem with regards to the annual council meeting.
Thank you very much.
There is a copy here for the press.
Can I ask Councillor Edwards to speak briefly? Can I ask Councillor Edwards to speak briefly now? And then I think we should move to consideration of the recommendation.
Before you do that, I am very clear that I was clear in pre-meeting that we will be moving a set of amendments. I have a copy of that, and I would like to just put those forward when we speak.
But I was doing the hindsight bit, and I was going to ask Councillor Edwards if he would like to make the last speech on that. But Councillor Hawkins isn't available.
I've been quite quiet.
You have.
Is he going to speak on something? I think Councillor Hawkins did want to speak. I mean, I just ask two quick questions. I mean, I accept that, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I think that there will be some challenges to make some of the decisions taken by the departing monitoring officer. So my question, I have two questions. First question is what risk assessments were done when we appointed the monitoring officer who wasn't a legally trained and a lawyer. And the second question, because of that we have to get pieces of council's advice, what cost of that to the council will that be part of the legal services costs?
Yeah, I can't recall what the risk assessment was at the remuneration where Marianne Sutton was appointed. Can you put the answer? Do you remember the risk assessment that was done? Were the risks highlighted at the remuneration committee was appointed?
I don't think they were highlighted, and that's one of the concerns in retrospect.
Fine. Okay.
But just going to make the remuneration committee had available to them all the relevant information to make that assessment. And so the funds received, etc., were apparent to the remuneration committee at that time.
I think, and you'll appreciate that, yes, I think the issues around the implications of the Section 101 agreement, Section 101, were, I think, probably not as clear to those of us who are not as well versed. And I would genuinely say that the understanding of what the ramifications were probably not as clear.
Could you finish, please?
So this is about the timeline of events recently. So wanted to find out clarification to one of the questions you responded to, Mr. Travers, regarding the departure of previous monitoring officer, when that came about. I haven't been given an email showing that her out of office reply did not mention, even as late as the 5th of October, mentioned that she would be out of office from the 12th of September, with no mention of Mr. Parker or anyone else, or yourself, delegating a decision for her.
The monitoring officer was on leave for a period until the agreed date of her departure, and she remained the monitoring officer through that period. Through that period, Jessica Farmer at HB Public Law was the deputy monitoring officer.
Well, I think this plays into a couple of other questions my colleagues have raised. I mean, for example, the whole issue of dispensations. We were given instructions, which we very much dispute, that the monitoring officers who can give us dispensation whenever we fancy, and yet we weren't clear who the monitoring officer was at the time if we were contacting Mary Allen. So why was that not made clear at the time that she was on the lead?
You recognise that it wouldn't be normal for members to be fully informed of the legal arrangements of officers, and there was a deputy in place. Yes.
This is not any officer, this is our monitoring officer, which we were instructed to discuss the matters with. My second point is the fundamental part of the interim arrangement we have now. Our colleagues in Westminster Council were rather surprised to hear about this, and the Chief Executive explained that that Peter was assisting Barnet due to some consequence of some staffing and capacity shortfalls within their council. Was this agreed with how is this agreed, and how is Peter's time shared between Westminster Council and ourselves?
Well, the original discussion, as the leader indicated earlier, was for Peter to be seconded to Barnet to provide assistance in general in respect of the governance service and legal matters. When it became apparent that Marion Salter's employment was likely to end as monitoring officer, then there was a discussion regarding Peter assuming the role of monitoring officer from the point of Marion's departure, and that's what has been agreed. Peter's secondment is currently for 2 days a week to be flexibly provided to Barnet to meet the requirements of a monitoring officer, and Peter has nominated Jessica Farmer from Bugle to be his deputy through this period.
Thank you. Sorry, but we must move on to considering the rest.
No, that's absolutely fine. I think before we do that, I want to move a set of amendments. And it would be no surprise given the questions that were asked tonight. I have handed to the member of governance service just a set of amendments as it would be moved, for example, at council, just so that it's very clear what we're moving. But I will read them out, and then I'll be asking for your support in these amendments. The first is to add at the end of recommendation 1, except signing the side agreement until legal services are brought back in-house. The second recommendation is to add a recommendation 2.1 that the vacant monitoring officer post must be filled by a legally qualified person, and this must be specified in the job description, the job advert. And I know that that is obviously a remuneration committee, but we have the power to do that. Third is to delete recommendation 3 and replace with the legal services brought back in-house to be part of the integrated assurance function. 4 is to add a recommendation 5 at the end, including that a limited scope of high-level corporate legal support is removed from the scope of the IAA and is instead provided in-house and or through separate external arrangements pending legal services being brought back in-house. And then to add a recommendation 6, there's a review of all decisions taken by LB Barnet since Barnet ceased to have a legally qualified monitoring officer is undertaken with the support of external legal advice. And I'm asking that you support these amendments.
I don't know what other members had a chance to consider this. I mean, the one that springs out, I have no problem with recommending that the new monitoring officer, when appointed, has a legal background. I think that would be a sensible thing to do. So,
that's fine, but I'm seeking your support for them in their entirety.
I'm afraid I can't support the entirety because I don't think it would be appropriate to bring legal services back in-house. I don't think it's practical and I don't think it's sensible. So that's no. And then I think we need to sign the IAA in the short term because we need to bring ourselves into compliance with what's actually happening. But I think we need to sign that with a caveat that we will be looking at that carefully in the short term.
but I don't think it's appropriate at all, no.
Leader, on that point, I would add the report does state that the committee's decisions and the clearing process for them is very robust and actually should apply to council. So I don't see why if the report says that the committee decisions have been gone through the right process, the papers have gone through the right process, that we then suddenly have this, you know, all-encompassing review. So for that reason, I would support that. I would join you in your sentiments.
If I might, it's not necessarily just a committee decisions. Clearly there have been a series of decisions, for example, around dispensations, around some decisions around leaders committee, and a range of other issues that have been taken, and therefore I think it is important that they are reviewed. If you feel unable to support those in their entirety, I would propose that you move this report to council.
Agreed. 4 members have done that, so that's all. So that's all this is one then. Thank you very much.
The lawyers look after the microphone.
Okay. So now we move on to item 8.